Hello and welcome to today's class. So I'm going to be working with the innocence of flower stamps and some masking tissue, or you can use film or paper, whichever you have to hand. So the one I'm using is from Chocolate Rock, and you're going to need your stamp platform for this one. So first of all, let's take a sheet of the masking tissue out of the packet, and then we can get started. So in this case, the masking tissue is like a washi type paper with adhesive, and then it's backed onto an acetate sheet. So make sure first of all that you have it the right way up in your stamp platform, otherwise this isn't going to work. And I do find, because you've got that acetate back, that you want to be using your magnets. Now, depending on how you want to lay your stamps out, you're going to notice I don't put a magnet in that top left corner. So then we can use our registration stamp. So our stamps are fabulous. They've been manufactured for us by Clarity, who do a fantastic service. And we've loved creating samples with these. So this is where mine start to fight back a bit and they don't want to come out of the packet. Didn't quite get them in their square when I put them away. So do make sure that you replace all your plastic level just to get them out of the packet nice and easy. So there we go. So we have our stamps. We can take off our release sheet nice and easy. Now, when we're working with our registration stamp, we want to be really careful with how we remove that acetate from the back. And we want to be very gentle, because what you don't want to do is to stretch your stamp. So you're going to notice I'm going to flick it over and then peel the acetate away from the back. So try and put one hand on the stamp and then pull the acetate. I also like to leave it a few moments after I've released that backing paper to just let it kind of settle back into shape. I'm then going to pop it down onto my paper rather than try and apply it to my stamp platform directly. And the reason I do that is, again, then it won't stretch. And you just want to decide which way around, which way around you want to do your stamp. Okay, so we've got our stamp mounted on there. And now what we're going to do is we're going to stamp using either Memento, VersaFine Clear, something that can handle detail. So those are kind of my two go-to inks for these stamps. And the reason that we do that is we want to make sure that our registration marks are nice and clear for the machine to read. And then they'll work. So the whole idea behind these stamps is that we can layer them up, not necessarily just in three-dimensional terms, but also in 2D terms as well. So don't feel like you have to have like lots of dimension, but they will nest perfectly so that you can create either that whole image at the top or the two down the bottom and actually create the same flower. Makes colouring really quick too. So as I said, you want to make sure that your registration marks are nice and clear. And you can see that one down the bottom left is still a little bit pale. So it's all about contrast as well. So if you're stamping onto a coloured card, for instance, you want to make sure that you have a really good contrast of ink, whether that be going all the way to black or even the opposite way and going to white. The unsafe bit is anywhere kind of in that middle ground. So then we're going to take our cutting mat and we can apply our masking tissue to the cutting mat. So as you can see here, with the magic of editing, I've filled my masking tissue, and I've done that with numerous copies of the stamps. Now, in terms of that registration stamp, you only really need one, because with the registration, you actually have a slight white border around. So you just want to be mindful of how many times you're going to need that white border. Whereas with your other flowers and leaves, we're going to use direct cut to actually cut those out. As we are working with masking tissue, I'm going to use the vinyl auto blade, and that's because it's going to be able to handle this delicate material much better. We can import our cut registration for our first stamp. And it's going to tell you which way up to put your registration marks. So long as you follow the instructions on screen, you should have a nice, easy time of it. If your map misbehaves, just unload it and try again. When you go to OK, it's then going to scan the sheet through and back again to see the registration marks. Now, if there is anything else on the map, and this is the reason why I'm demonstrating this, it won't be able to necessarily see those registration marks. Oh, and make sure that a half cut is turned on. Kind of important. If you do full cut, it's going to try and go through that acetate as well, which may be useful in some respects, but it's a bit more fiddly to put the acetate back on after you've finished with your mask. And the benefit of using masking tissue is that we can use it for numerous projects. So it's not a case of use once and done. This is something that you can save and you can reuse as many times as you need. So here you go. As you can see, failed to recognise the registration marks, and it's just because those other images are on that stamp. Okay, so what we can do instead is actually cut away that registered image. So you can do this using your guillotine or your trimmer. So here I'm going to just pop that under, and we can divide that masking sheet into two. Okay, so with that done, then we can move back to the machine and cut that out using those registration marks. So, like I said, they do cut out with a slight white border, but let's skip ahead to the second phase. Okay, if you happen to have an older ScanNCut model, so a CM model, you aren't going to be able to use the auto registration. So you can either use the provided cut file without the registration, or you can use direct cut. Now, for the masking tissue, I'm going to use the direct cut option. So let's go to our frame. We're going to pull that in. So we're just looking at that stamped image. Okay. Then we're going to go OK. So do use your stylus if possible. Mine keeps disappearing on me though. Okay, so we have our traced image and we have those registration marks cutting out. So first of all, we can use ignore object sizes to actually knock those out of the way. However, if you look carefully, we do lose one of the leaves. So we may want to get that back in. So we've turned the smoothing up as much as possible so that it kind of loses that sense of detail in those leaves. Now, I'm not happy with how those leaves are cutting out, so I can just cut out the two flowers. We can offset if you want to. I take it down 0.01 inches so that it cuts slightly inside. And that's so that we're getting an accurate mask. So even if we use a post-it note as a mask for a stamped image, you want to be cutting slightly inside your black line. And then we know that when we stamp over the top, we're not going to get that kind of white halo appearance that you can get. And then that's going to cut out on that half cut, and we should have a perfect cut. Okay, so with that now cut, we can remove them from the mat and get started with the rest of the cutting. So let's unload the mat. And then we can get on with the rest of the project. So moving back to my desk, we can peel away our masking, and you can see that the design lifts away easily from its supporting acetate. And we can keep it on that sheet until we need it. And you can remove the background sheet too if you want. We can then do the same for the other half of the masking sheet with that same negative offset so that we make sure that we're kind of cutting away that little extra to avoid the halo. Okay, so now that we've cut out all of our designs, they should lift away easily from our acetate, and then we can pop that to one side and we can start our main project. So I'm going to be using a magnetic board, and I've added a piece of sticky cutting mat just to kind of help me be able to create without having those magnets on the card. And we're going to start with the stencils. So let's start with the foliage stencil. And I can move one of my magnets to hold that stencil in place. So feel free to move the stencil around to get the kind of formation that you want. I'm going to be building up into this bottom corner, so that layout kind of works for me. If you want to do a slightly different bouquet, then feel free to move that stencil around. And the magnets are super strong, so they're going to hold that in place as we're doing our ink blending. So just mask off any little tips of leaves that are around the outside that you might catch by accident. And then you can just focus on those leaves that you want to keep. So we're going to be working with a fairly large blending brush, and we're going to want some ink. So in this case, I'm starting with Peel Paint, which is quite a strong but muted green. And we're going to brush that really quickly over all of our leaves. And the goal here isn't to have perfectly even coverage. We want to have some variety in our leaves so they look like they are shifting and moving. And then we can blend away all the excess ink off our stencil. And lift that off. Now we could go in and do all the shading and things for our leaves, but just for now, we're just going to move our stencil around to fill in any gaps that we think we need to. Obviously being mindful of those magnets. So just because I'm just doing one really quick leaf, there's not much point reapplying masking and everything else. So I'll just do that really quick with what's left on the brush. Don't forget to remove all your washi tape that you've used as masking. And then you can clean your stencil with a damp cloth. So I use a bamboo cloth and a little bit of water, but you could use a baby wipe, as long as it's one of these ones that's water-based. And that will just come straight off. Nice and simple. Okay, now let's bring our card back in. Okay, so we've created our background and now we want to build up our bouquet design over the top. So you can use either a large or a small stamp holder to actually create this design with. So the larger one is more flexible. As you can see here, it's flexing quite a bit. So that's really good for where you want to kind of have something that's going over your masking. It gives you that little bit more ability to squidge it. Technical term, we can squidge. Now that one magnet is just getting in just the wrong place. I'm going to have a bit of a shift around. So I'm using Versaclear ink so that we're getting nice crisp images. And I'm working from the front to the back. So you're going to start off with your main focal images first, then mask those using the pieces that we've already cut. And then we can build up the layers beneath and so on and so forth, working right to the background. You do have to do it in order, otherwise your masking gets a bit complicated. Especially when it comes to peeling it away to do the colouring. So we've done our two large flowers, and I'm going to work with the petals that we can actually use as buds, or we can actually build them up as additional layers behind our flower. So I'm just going to stamp those next. And all the time I'm thinking about the overall shape of the bouquet that I want to do. So I want to kind of focus on it being this kind of curve around the corner. And our image can help us with that. Now, if you think I need to stamp somewhere and it's going to overlap a flower, that's when we start to place our masking tissue. And you'll see that I very gently place it down and then brush it down from the center out. That's so that we don't accidentally damage our masking. So as I said, with care, you can actually use these masking pieces again and again. So now I want to get the angle right. And don't think you have to have this kind of perfectly spaced arrangement, because nature just isn't like that. And again, we can use that same bamboo sheet with a little water, just clean the stamp off. Just be aware that anything you do use for cleaning, if there are any loose fibres on it, these will transfer to the stamp. So try and clear that off as much as possible before stamping with that stamp. So I'm just going to pop some masking over those buds that I've just stamped. And that means that I can be a bit more carefree with my stamping for this next layer. So this next layer of stamping is going to be behind these buds. And that's just something to bear in mind. And even if you don't stamp an image perfectly, don't get kind of hung up about trying to replace that image to get it perfectly stamped. We're going to be doing lots of colouring on top of these, so you won't notice. Place your masking tissue on top. Even if you aren't going to stamp over these images, if you place the masking tissue there ready, it'll be ready for when you do the colouring. Which is why we've done lots of copies of these leaves and flowers and buds. Okay, now we can move on to the leaf design. And I'm going for the larger leaf to begin with. And this time I'm going to stamp in the rustic wilderness. So when we're stamping with distress inks, we're not aiming to get a pinpoint perfect impression. It's there so that we can work with things like watercolor pens, water brushes, and actually pull that ink into our design. But also if we're doing our ink blending over the top, it's going to kind of tie the two in together. And try to always rotate that stamp before you place it for the next image, and then you'll get something that feels quite natural. Odd numbers work best, which is something to bear in mind as you're doing these things. So you'll notice I've got 3 buds, 3 of the smaller flowers, And then in terms of your leaves, you want to kind of mix those up a bit as well. So we've got 7 of the larger leaves, and then we'll go and do the little leaves, and we might just do 5 of those. It's whatever fits and suits. And before I stamp those, don't forget to do your masking. I've also popped the masking onto some of the stenciled leaves as well, so that we can have some of those come to the foreground. And then we can stamp our little leaf. And we kind of want to use this as like a little filler, so we can do some of the leaves around the outside of the flower, like our main focal image from the collection. But we don't have to do all of them. So you can see I just do a few where it makes sense, and then I'll miss them out. And of course, we have our colouring stencil, so colouring this is going to be super quick and easy. So don't get daunted by, oh, that's so many images to colour. And already you can see just the effect of using those 2 different colours of inks. You can already quite clearly read what is a leaf and what is a flower. So your colouring can be really subtle, or if you want to go to the other extreme and go really bold, you can do. So I'm going to hop back to the smaller flower, and I want to put some of these right into the background. So as long as everything is masked, whatever we stamp now is going right into the distance, or underlying, if you see what I mean. So although, we said about having those 3 that are up above, then we can start to infill those gaps too. And don't be afraid to give that a go. Okay, so I'm going to break out my layering stencil, and that's going to help me colour my images. Now we're going to start from the background and move forward. So you can remove 1 lot of masking tissue, then you're going to colour. So start first with any images that you don't have masked. So those would be the most recently stamped items. And because we've done that masking, means that we don't have to worry so much about where we're putting that colour. We can just concentrate on just the item. Line up the stencil. And we're going to brush from the centre of the leaf outwards, and then just add a little colour to the tip, and you're going to then have a leaf that curls. Now, it is easier if you work with one particular type of image in one go. Save you swapping brushes all the time. So you'll notice that I'm doing all the larger leaves first. But then when I get to one that is masked and stamped over, I want to swap to some to the next shape. And we can come back and do that leaf in a bit. So now I'm going to do the little leaves because they're not masked either. And although we're working with the leaves in roughly the same position as they would be on the main stamp, there will be some slight variations. So don't be surprised if you end up rejigging that stencil a little bit as you work round. And you can make these colours darker as they kind of sink into the layers as well. So you're giving that shaded effect, and you'll find that you'll get much more of a 3D pop. So at the moment I'm being quite gentle and working with very transparent layers of colour. But you could be going much stronger than this if you want to. And of course, the blending tools that you're using will affect that too. So don't be surprised if you're switching between different brushes or using brushes and sponges, that you're going to get lots of different effects from the same ink pad. So now we can go back through and we can add some detail using a thinner blending brush. And we can use either our main leaf stencil here, so we can just add generalized colour to the centres, or we can go into the shading layer to actually build up that kind of fold that you naturally get in a leaf as we move towards that centre vein. And I'm using kind of a flicking motion, but I'm also trying to change the angle of that flicking motion as well, so that I don't get like a lighter line that goes down the centre of my stencil. And of course, you could also use your layering stencil wet in areas that you haven't stamped as well to create a different look of a leaf. So where we've got those leaves in the background that were just stencil only, we can mimic that with the layering stencil too for our little leaves and some of the other details. So now I'm going to go in with one of the shading stencils to add that depth to give us that curl of leaf. And I'm going to use one half to do kind of that centre vein, and then the other half to do the curl of the leaf on the outside edge, so that you get a really nice shaded image of your leaf nice and easily. So I've kind of done all the hard work for you. All you've got to do is just follow the lessons and the shading and just think, where's your light source coming from? So the stencils do come with classes as well. They are exclusive when you buy the stencils. So again, I'm going to use that layering just to add a bit of shading to our stenciled images as well. a bit rude not to, as we're here already. And it's just going to make that background a little bit more interesting and a little bit more tied into our main image, which is something you want to be aware of, that, you know, you're not taking this kind of bouquet and sticking it on top of a background. You want the two to kind of tie together and be harmonious. So for our flowers, we're going to use Sponge Sugar and Milled Lavender. I'm going to start with Sponge Sugar first, place the stencil over the top and blend in that colour. Now we can always go stronger, but it's going to be a lot more difficult to go lighter. So start with a fairly light hand and use the two colours to kind of create like a two-tone effect. So I'm working the darker colour around the outside of the petals and where we have things overhanging, so like leaves that are overhanging the flower, then we'll colour in that flower. If you have leaves that haven't been unmasked yet that actually pop over, just peel that away. It's really easy to get kind of waylaid. So just work through from the top layer of masking to the bottom layer of masking, and then you won't go wrong. So whatever is sitting on top, peel that away. And I'm going to do that for these leaves. So we'll do those next. So we can go back to our peeled paint and Rustic Wilderness and shade those in. If some of your leaves overlie the stenciled leaves beneath, then you can just apply a stronger colour to mask that edge and blend it in together. Like so. And you can still do all the same shading that we did on the first set of leaves. And be sure to use the excess of your stencil as well. Waste nothing. And that way your blending brushes will also be easier to clean. So now moving to the Rustic Wilderness, and then we can use our finer blending brushes to just add that little touch of shading. And we're going to get a much more 3D look. So you use both halves of the stencil just in different ways. So always try to change up the direction that you're going in. So if you use the center line on one half of that shaded stencil, then use either the opposite edge or work from the center out. And you're going to build these nice shaped leaves. They're going to be really visually interesting. Just by changing how you're applying the ink through the stencil, you're going to create leaves that curl in different ways, have different colouring in terms of their actual base shade. So if we were to flatten the leaves, no two leaves would have the same colours. And so we don't want to do that with our stamping. We want to kind of change it up a little bit. And do some of that shading to your stenciled images as well. And it doesn't have to be tons. Sometimes it'd just be like 3 flicks to get that coloured in. So I'm going to reveal the next layers, and then we can work on those. So this time we're going back to the pink. We're going to use our Sponge Sugar and then shade with our milled lavender. So continue to work around your image, removing those layers as you need to. And don't forget to use those shading layers on your stencil. So they're really a super quick way of adding shading without having to really work hard at it. So we can pop that over the top and brush the colour into the centre. If we want to create a dip into our flower, we can go from the top of the flower if we want to add that kind of inference of having that shadow coming from that larger flower above. And same with the flower that tucks underneath that top flower as well. So we've got the shading that's coming from having that bud that's over the top, but also the flower beneath it overlies that little flower as well. So work your way through, and you've also got the really detailed fine stencil for some of the shading too. Now this particular stencil means that you have to use a smaller blending brush to be able to get the most out of those little details. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you are working with blending sponges, you aren't going to get anywhere near the right amount of coverage through that detailed stencil. So now, rather than working with the layering stencil, we're working over the buds, and I just want to be able to just add a little bit of shading freehand. And then we can blend over the top with the sponge sugar. And that's going to make our blend more harmonious with our flowers that are already on there. And then we can peel away the masking for our 2 focal images. And if you wanted to leave these pure white, you could do. If you wanted to add just some shading to suggest that they're paler than the little flowers, then you could do that with the milled lavender and just skip the sponge sugar. Or you might want to go the other way and actually have them so the colour is more pronounced, in which case there's dusty concord that we could add in to kind of create that shading. So for speed, I've swapped to a blending sponge, and this means that we can apply a large amount of ink very quickly. So you're going to see I'm using sponge sugar, and it is going to pull out a little bit of the ink that we already have in our sponge. So if it's coming out slightly too orange, then just move it around to a different area of your sponge. I do keep different sponges for different colour families, so you do get a little bit of cross-contamination, but not much. So now we've got a nice peach tone. We can go back in with some of our shading stencils to actually create the curves of our petal. And you can do this with some more sponge sugar if you want, or if you want to go to the milled lavender to have a bit stronger of a shade, we can do that. Or you can go really dark to our dusty concord. Now, because our base layer is so strong, that dusty concord isn't going to look quite so intense as it might otherwise do. Just tap off the excess on your stencil and then blend onto your actual artwork. Just because you can always add more, but you can't take away. And we'll repeat that for the other flower. So we're very nearly done with our bouquet. And this effect, while it looks really 3D, is really good for postage because it's totally flat. So by using the detail stencil, we can easily add shading to our flowers. So I'm focusing on the bottom edge for our flower curls so that we're getting that kind of lift up effect. And also don't forget to reflect any elements that might be kind of curling up to the same level as the flower. So for instance, that middle bud could be lifting up at the diagonal, for instance. Then we're just going to blend around the edges using our blending sponge. It's just a really quick way of just getting a lot of colour on at once. If you want to then blend those tones in a bit with a blending brush, you can do. Just if you try and do it all with a blending brush, it's going to take you a long time to get the same level of coverage. So a sponge is going to make that process a lot quicker. So you can build up that colour as much as you want to around those edges. And like I said, you can always blend that out with a blending brush if you're finding that you're getting too many harsh contrast between where you sponged and that initial background colour. I'm working onto cream, so it is a little bit more forgiving than if you're working onto white. And we can then pop in our card blank into our stamp platform, and we can use one of the 3 sentiments that are in the set. So I have purposely designed it so that we have 3 sentiments that are going to fill different ratios of spaces. So we have 1 long thin line, we have a 2-line sentiment, and we have a 3-line sentiment. And what I would recommend doing is using the acetate registration sheet to kind of give you an idea of how that's going to look on your card once it's stamped. And we can stamp that using the same ink as we used for our flowers so that we get a nice clear image. Try not to use too much pressure when we're stamping with text, otherwise you can find that your text smudges a little or squidges. So you want to avoid that. So firm but gentle pressure. It's a fine balancing point to get that right. That's one of the benefits of the stamp platform, is if you find that it hasn't quite stamped fully, you can go back down. So you're almost better to use less pressure and have to stamp twice when it comes to your text. And that's the same with any manufacturer's text stamp. So I hope you have enjoyed the video today. Do like and subscribe, and see you again soon. Bye for now.